What if you outlived the very sentence meant to end your life? In America, men and women have survived behind bars for nearly 70 years, sometimes for crimes they never committed, sometimes with only their own memories for company. Imagine being Ricky Jackson, condemned at 22 on a child's lie, or Charles Ford, buried alive by hidden evidence for 64 years. This is the true story of those who endured impossible punishment, of lives frozen by injustice, and the one thing no prison could sentence: time itself. How does anyone survive this long, and what does freedom mean after losing a lifetime? In 1975, Ricky Jackson was just 18 when his world collapsed in a Cleveland courtroom. The evidence against him rested almost entirely on the words of a 12-year-old boy, Eddie Vernon. Jackson, along with two friends, was sentenced to death for a murder he did not commit. The jury believed the child's story, never knowing the pressure that shaped it. Years passed. Jackson's sentence shifted from death to life, but the bars remained. He spent 39 years inside, nearly 4 decades in a system that relies on memory, yet so often fails to question how memory is made. Eddie Vernon's testimony was not just mistaken, it was manufactured by fear and authority. He later described how detectives coached him, threatened him, and filled in details he never witnessed. The psychology of a child's memory is fragile, especially under the weight of police suggestion and the hunger for a quick conviction. Vernon's guilt followed him into adulthood, a secret he carried for decades. It took almost 40 years, and the intervention of a local pastor, for Vernon to finally confess the truth. In 2013, in a quiet church hallway, he admitted to Pastor Daly that he had lied. The pastor urged him to document everything, and soon, the Ohio Innocence Project took up the case. Legal filings followed, and the courts reopened the file. In November 2014, Jackson walked free at age 57. The state awarded him $2.65 million in compensation, but no amount could restore the birthdays missed, the family lost, or the time erased. For Jackson, freedom came at a cost beyond calculation. His story is a stark reminder: a single coerced memory can steal a lifetime. The question lingers: how many more sentences are built on the shifting ground of unreliable testimony? Years served, 39, age in, 18, age out, 57, release basis, exoneration after witness recantation. Charles Ford entered prison in 1952, a young black man in segregated Maryland, convicted of murder by an all-white jury. He always insisted on his innocence. For years, his appeals went unheard, trapped by a system that offered little hope to men like him. The decades rolled on. Ford's case sat in the archives, gathering dust, while he grew old behind concrete walls. He watched the world change from the narrow window of his cell, outliving friends, outlasting even the memory of his own trial. In the mid-2010s, pro bono attorneys began to sift through the old court files. They discovered a critical failure in the original trial. The judge had never informed Ford of his right to appeal. This breach of due process, overlooked for more than half a century, would finally open a door that had been shut since Eisenhower was president. There was no hidden alibi, no dramatic new witness, just a record of rights denied and a lifetime spent waiting for the law to catch up. By 2016, Ford had served 64 years. The court vacated his conviction, acknowledging that justice had failed him at every turn. But the years had taken their toll. Ford, now 84, was too frail to return to ordinary life. He left prison not for home, but for a nursing facility, his freedom coming as a formality, a technical correction to a sentence that had already consumed nearly all he had. Family gathered to see him released, tears mixing relief with sorrow. The relief was for the injustice finally recognized. The sorrow was for the decades lost to a cell. Ford's story lingers as a question. When the law takes a lifetime to correct its mistakes, can it ever truly restore what was taken? For Charles Ford, justice arrived long after time had done its work. Betty Smithy entered Arizona's state prison system in 1963 at the age of 20, sentenced to life for a crime that left the public demanding nothing less. For decades, every attempt at parole was denied. Board transcripts from 1994, 2004, and again in 2010 show a familiar refrain. Her remorse was questioned, her early conduct scrutinized, and the nature of her conviction weighed against any sign of change. But time, relentless and indifferent, pressed on. Smythe did not remain the person she was at 20. The years inside saw her turn to education, filling notebooks with poetry and letters, seeking meaning in routines that rarely changed. She became a mentor to younger inmates, teaching them to read, helping them complete coursework, and quietly building a record of nonviolence that spanned decades. By 2012, Smithy was 69. Her hair had gone white, her movement slowed by age. Correctional staff spoke on her behalf, describing her as a stabilizing presence, someone who had, in the words of one officer, done more to keep the peace than most of us ever could. During her final clemency hearing, a board member read aloud, "No prisoner in Arizona history has demonstrated more concrete steps toward change than Ms. Smithy, and her risk to society is now negligible." The decision was not easy. The severity of her original crime weighed heavily, but the board faced a question that echoes through every case like hers. How do we measure a life spent in the effort to change? When clemency was granted, Smithy walked out after 49 years, blinking into the Arizona sun. Her release did not erase her past, nor did it guarantee forgiveness. Legal mercy and moral forgiveness rarely arrive together, yet her story stands as proof that transformation can outlast even the longest sentence, and that mercy, when it comes, is often less about the past than the possibility of a different future. Years served, 49. Age in, 20. Age out, 69. Release basis, clemency after decades of rehabilitation. Thomas Trantino entered New Jersey's death row in 1964, his fate sealed by a double police homicide conviction. For nearly a decade, he lived under the shadow of execution until the ground shifted beneath the justice system itself. In 1972, the state abolished the death penalty. Overnight, every condemned prisoner's sentence was upended. Trantino's death warrant vanished, replaced with a new reality: life imprisonment. The governor's staff moved quickly, drafting memos that would commute all outstanding death sentences. The decision was sweeping, designed to avoid the appearance of selective mercy or political favoritism. In the streets outside Rahway Prison, police unions staged protests, demanding that the men who killed their own never see daylight again. The new policy set a hard minimum: no parole before 25 years for anyone once slated to die. Trantino's case became a lightning rod. Families of the fallen officers spoke out at every hearing, arguing that the law might change, but the wounds did not. Yet the law was clear. After decades behind bars, Trantino began to write poems, essays, reflections on guilt and the meaning of punishment. His words circled the question that haunted his case: can a legal system's pivot erase a moral debt? By 2002, after 39 years, the parole board faced a dilemma. The original sentence was gone, the law had evolved, but the pain remained. Trantino was released under strict supervision, his freedom shaped by the boundaries of the new statute. The protests never fully faded. His story stands as a testament to the collision between legal reform and the enduring weight of loss. Years served, 39. Age in, 25. Age out, 64. Release basis, commutation after death penalty repeal and statutory minimum served. Joseph Ligon was 15 years old when a Pennsylvania judge told him he would never leave prison. The year was 1953. He could not read or write, and his world had never stretched far beyond the neighborhoods of North Philadelphia. Ligon and a group of teenagers had been swept up in a violent night. 2 people were killed, and the city wanted answers. Tried as an adult, Ligon faced the full weight of the law. His trial lasted a single day. There was no discussion of his age, no recognition of the difference between a child and a man. The sentence: life without the possibility of parole. As the decades passed, the world outside changed beyond recognition. Ligon remained a constant in the prison system, moving from one facility to another, his life measured in cell blocks and count times. He learned to navigate the rules and routines, finding a kind of safety in the predictability of institutional life. Parole boards offered him release more than once, but always with a catch. He would have to accept lifelong supervision. Ligon refused. After so many years, freedom tied to parole felt like another kind of prison. In 2012, the Supreme Court ruled in Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional. This decision forced states to review old cases, and Ligon's name rose to the top of the list. Even then, he hesitated. At 83, he had spent nearly 7 decades behind bars. Adjusting to the outside world meant facing a reality he had never known as an adult. A juvenile justice scholar put it simply: almost no one expects to die in prison for something they did at 15. Ligon's story challenges the idea of responsibility, asking where the line falls between punishment and the possibility of change. Years served, 68. Age in 15. Age out, 83. Release basis, constitutional reform, unconditional release. Harvey Stewart's name appeared and disappeared from prison rosters for nearly 6 decades. He first entered Louisiana's correctional system in 1959, a teenager with a short temper and little family to claim him. His rap sheet grew over the years: burglary, assault, parole violations, each new sentence adding years onto a life spent behind concrete. Stewart was not a headline case, nor a subject of exoneration campaigns. He was a chronic returnee, caught in the revolving door of American incarceration. Prison files show a man who struggled to follow the rules but kept coming back. Over 40 disciplinary write-ups, months in solitary, and yet a folder thick with vocational certificates: welding, carpentry, custodial maintenance. Stewart passed the same GED exam 3 times, each during a different stretch inside. He was, by all accounts, a model trainee and a frequent troublemaker, the contradiction never resolved. His visitor logs tell a quieter story. The last recorded visit was in 2005. After that, names faded from the ledger. The outside world moved on, but Stewart remained, his identity stitched into the daily rhythm of roll calls and work assignments. A re-entry coordinator once described the gap: "We offer a bus ticket and a pamphlet, but there's no real bridge between prison and life outside." Stewart himself put it more bluntly: "Imagine 60 years down in this damn hole. At some point, you forget there's an outside." By the end, Stewart's cumulative time behind bars totaled 59 years. Each release felt temporary, each return more certain. For men like Stewart, the question is not just why they come back, but whether they ever truly left. Hospitals inside prison walls are not designed for the slow decay of old age. In New York, the law recognizes this gap with a single directive, 4307, spelling out when and how the system can let go of those too sick or frail to serve any further purpose behind bars. In 2021, budget hearings revealed the scale of the problem. Some inmates, well past 80, cost the state more than $350,000 a year in medical care. These are men and women whose bodies have become evidence of time's victory over punishment. Directive 4307 allows for medical parole under extraordinary circumstances, when an inmate is so incapacitated that public safety is no longer at risk. The process is not simple. Prison doctors submit thick files. Administrators weigh prognosis against policy. For each case, the question is the same: does mercy now serve the public, or is it just a fiscal necessity? A gerontologist called before the committee described the limits of prison healthcare with quiet certainty. Chronic illness, dementia, end-stage cancer, these are conditions prison was never built to manage. The testimony pointed to a future where the cost of keeping the old and dying behind bars would force more releases, not out of compassion, but out of arithmetic. John Bunn's name appeared on a list of those considered for medical parole. At 94, his care expenses had eclipsed the average by 5 times. The decision to release was less about forgiveness, more about the unsustainable burden of age. In those final years, the question hanging over the system was not just justice, but what to do when time itself becomes the greater sentence. John "Sonny" Franzese once commanded fear and respect from the heart of New York's underworld. His name filled FBI wiretaps, his voice clipped and certain. "I'll die before I talk, capiche?" Yet time, not law, proved the greater adversary. By the time Franzese walked out of prison in 2019, he was 100 years old. The world he had ruled was gone. The last mugshot showed a fragile man, hands shaking as he clutched a rosary. In a rare interview at age 103, his words were softer, stripped of bravado. "What's left now is just memory, not empire." Franzese spent over 40 years behind bars, his sentences scattered across decades of racketeering and extortion. Each return to prison chipped away at the legend until only the man remained. The files from his final parole hearing read like a ledger of losses. Friends dead, family scattered, old alliances dissolved by time and mortality. For all the headlines about mafia codes and omerta, his release was met with silence. There was no one left to greet him. James Moore's story closes the circle from notoriety to anonymity. Convicted in 1962 at age 23, Moore served 60 years for a single act of violence. By the time the parole board granted his release in 2022, he was 85 and had lost both legs to diabetes. He entered a care home, not a family dinner. The official paperwork listed his status as parolee medical necessity. The only photograph from his first day of freedom shows a wheelchair beside a window, the world outside just out of reach. These men survived sentences meant to outlast them. What they found at the far edge of punishment was not redemption or triumph, but the quiet weight of memory and decline. For some, freedom arrives too late to matter. For others, it is a reminder that justice, once measured in years, is finally counted in what remains: a name, a memory, a body marked by time. In this film, we have seen men and women released after 40, 50, even 68 years behind bars. Some proven innocent, others changed by decades lost. Ricky Jackson served 39 years for a crime he did not commit, freed only after a key witness recanted. Joseph Ligon, sentenced at 15, left prison at 83 following a Supreme Court ruling on juvenile life sentences. Charles Ford waited 64 years for evidence to surface. Yet for every document unsealed, many files on these cases remain classified or incomplete. We know that over 2,000 Americans today are serving sentences of 50 years or more. The system that once promised justice has often delivered only time. As reforms continue, the question persists: does a life sentence serve society, or does it simply erase a life? The facts remain. Freedom after a lifetime is survival, not restoration.